Okay, we are live. Welcome, everybody. We've got Jedediah joining us tonight. Oh, I wanted to put a link in the chat as well so that if anybody would like to join us in our imaginal adventures, more than welcome to. I'm trying to remember where we left off, Luke. Do you know?
Yeah, it was right where he gets into the faith question. So
is it the Lord Bacon?
You'll have to pardon me. I don't even have it pulled up yet.
I'm gonna ditch this tea bag real quick.
Oh no, we read the thing about imagination is much akin to miracle working faith. Full globe humanity, we read that. Yeah, okay. I think we left off at the leaf is the imperfect flower, right? When we turn to history, however, we find the greatest operative. Yeah, I think that's where we're going. Starting. I'm sorry, everybody who's watching. We should have done this before we went live.
We were too busy talking about other things.
More important things. Oh, yeah, that's where we are because I remember Jason saying the first conversation I had with Sherry, she just kept saying, the leaf is the flower, the leaf is the flower.
Yeah.
So I think that's where we left off. Okay. So Jed, do you have a copy?
I don't. So I'm just going to be.
Goodness. I'm just going to send it to you real quick on the Voxer.
Okay. We could put it in the I don't know, the chat. I don't know how to access that.
I don't know either. So bad. Wait, let me see if I can. I always panic because when I click on a tab, you guys disappear, and then I'm like, I feel like.
There it is.
Well, tell me if I freeze into a pillar of salt because that tends to happen.
Yeah, I will. Let me see how can I anyways, sorry folks. If you want to
I'll get the link in there.
Can you?
I'll put the link in. Yeah.
Oh, thank you.
I just picked it up from you, so I'll snap it and.
Perfect.
First things first, I'll open it up.
And then
there we go. So the MacDonald article is in the chat for you guys as we're getting started.
Mm-hmm.
So we're about 24 paragraphs down. I was just counting. The first sentence is, we turn to history, however we find probably. So that's
okay.
where we're.
When we turn to history? Okay, gotcha.
When we turn, yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so I'll just read this first paragraph here. When we turn to history, however, we find probably the greatest operative sphere of the intellectuo-constructive imagination. Okay. To discover its laws, the cycles in which events return, with the reasons of their return, recognizing them notwithstanding metamorphosis, to perceive the vital motions of this spiritual body of mankind, to learn from its facts the rule of God, to construct from a succession of broken indications a whole accordant with human nature, to approach a scheme of the forces at work, the passions overwhelming or upheaving, the aspirations securely upraising, the selfishnesses debasing and crumbling, with the vital interworking of the whole, to illuminate all from the analogy with individual life and from the predominant phases of individual character which are taken as the mind of the people. This is the province of the imagination. It's a really long sentence, but we'll go back. Without her influence, no process of recording events can develop into a history. As truly might that be called the description of a volcano, which occupied itself with the delineation of the shapes assumed by the smoke expelled from the mountain's burning bosom. What history becomes under the full sway of the imagination may be seen in The History of the French Revolution by Thomas Carlyle, at once a true picture, a philosophical revelation, a noble poem.
It sounds like he's reading Hegel.
Well, I don't. He read everything.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. That's
yeah,
really
he did. He just read everything, and you know, I was telling Luke recently that, as to who influences George MacDonald, it's very up in the air because he doesn't talk about it. So you know, there's a lot of his letters that are published. He was, you know, they found out that he had relationships to people just because he gave them copies of his books and wrote personal notes in them to them.
Mm-hmm.
But he never kept, if he corresponded with them, their letters weren't kept. And there was no mention of them in any of his diaries or his personal letters, you know? So I'm kind of putting together a picture of this man. And he wrote a poem called A Hidden Life, which I plan to read on the channel at some point. But in that poem, he just describes a very humble, very intelligent man who I think probably describes his character quite well. And his son, or both his sons, Ronald and Greville, have said that if, you know, it's always a frightening thing to meet your favorite author, right? Because they often don't match up to what you think they would be. But George MacDonald is not that man. He is precisely the person that you think he is through his writings. And I think it's really caught up in humility. And so for that reason, I imagine that he read a lot of people and put together, you know, an articulation through them of his intuitions. And so what am I trying to say? But doesn't actually quote them, right? He doesn't reference them. He doesn't have footnotes in his writings, you know? So anyway, go on with the Hegel thing, because I don't know Hegel very much.
Well, I'll back up because there's something interesting. I think it's interesting to tie it to his person and then what we're seeing here in this paragraph with that volcanic image that he used.
Okay.
So I had to do some research for some, I was in a novel I wrote, I needed to know geography. And in order to understand the geography, I needed to understand the geology. So I went on this long, deep dive into geology. And one of the things that I found to be very interesting is how they described how extrusive rock and the extrusive rock formations in like the Hawaiian island chains form, right? It's through extrusion, right? Where something is being put through under tremendous pressure and then is, pushed through the narrow tube. I mean, and that's, extrusion is also a process in manufacturing, but it's a natural process. And I think like, if you think about like the body of work that MacDonald has given us, is those are coming from some powerful subterranean forces.
Right.
And it's
really
being
beautiful.
And what's interesting is it's all, for that to happen, it has to go through this narrow aperture so that it can then go into its expression, whether it's explosive, however you want to look at that. I would, but I think that like, in a sense, he's maybe become his own island of thought. You know,
Yeah, I get
in
that
sense
sense
of
too.
like kind of how those volcanic islands form through that. Hey, what's up?
Hi, Grim.
So I like that, and I think that he's what he's talking about in this um, paragraph is interesting, because it does sound Hegelian and a Hegelian understanding of history, but also like how our imaginations shape the history. Because
Right.
whatever, and he talked about that, like the writing of the facts, the discrete events that comprise history.
Yeah.
We don't actually have access to those events.
Yeah.
We have access to the record of those events.
Yeah.
And the
Yeah.
record of those events had to be arranged in a way that gives us access to that. So really the only access we have is through the record in the present. That's what the past is for us.
Yeah.
And that's been shaped by the imagination, right? But I think he's talking about something deeper in terms of like the historical process itself. And it seems quite cohesive with his thinking, in general, about the spiritual body of mankind, and his kind of his universal vision.
Right.
Is like what he's if I'm gleaning anything from this, and I'll keep my remarks short, but what I'm gleaning is his sense of like history as the producing of that whole redeemed company.
Right. Like he talked just
a
previous.
living process that is ultimately culminating in this final reconciliation.
Right.
So anyway, that's just a little thing I'm seeing in what he's saying here, which I think is interesting, that it takes the imagination, in MacDonald's reckoning here, to be able to see that.
Well, there's a quote here. He says, all the processes of the ages are God's science. All the flow of history is his poetry. And in the in the let me see if I can find it here. Oh, now I forgot what I was going to say. Just like that. What was it? Oh, here in the paragraph before, he talked about, where is it? Anyway, I forgot already what I was going to say.
I don't want to interrupt, but maybe I can ask you a little bit.
It's a good time to do it.
I will. I'm curious. In bringing up Hegel too, I guess what I see is what it takes to hold any dialectical process in tension is a extraordinarily limber mind. And I think that probably has something to do with the function of the imagination, obviously. But to be able to alternate dynamically between like antinomies, and you see someone like I've been watching a bunch of Ian McGilchrist videos, and actually I've watched one 3 times today, because it just takes me that long to sometimes catch everything that's being said. But like his constant interplay between these, like, the coincidence of opposites and stuff like that he's constantly seeing, and this irony that's constantly available to his mind. And it's just, I don't know, it seems like that's something that's available with George MacDonald as well,
Yeah. Well, and I think,
is this because of the dialectic, like the Hegelian? I see, like I'm a little bit dumb when it comes to Hegel.
I think so, Sherry, I would say, like, in some ways you're thinking, like, I wouldn't necessarily say like you're like Hegelian, but you do embody a kind of a dialectical kind of thinking where you are seeing the oppositions in union.
What? Okay, so is that what dialectical means? Because I don't know.
In some senses it can be, like the Hegelian dialectic is it's essentially it's a synthetic process where you have a thesis and an antithesis.
Okay.
Right. And those opposing forces whatever they may be, he'll talk about this as a historical process, but those opposing forces clash and then synthesize into a new synthesis, and then the process continues. And so that's kind of the dialectical view of history that he takes. And I mean, he has it's not, that's a very shorthand way of describing an aspect of his thinking, but that's probably the most famous aspect of his thinking.
And honestly, that's where my knowledge of Hegel sort of falls short, just beyond that.
Well, I'm just wondering now, like after talking about George MacDonald as a person, like how much of Hegel he actually read. Because if I'm Hegelian, and I never read Hegel, don't even know what dialectic means, like there's a good chance that happens for other people too, right? Like for me, it's like you see the pattern playing itself out, right? In nature, for me personally. And then it's just a natural, like, all senses of that word, conclusion,
Right. Well, so let's use that natural, like, let's use the dialectic like how oppositional forces are at work in nature, with growing things, right? They're having to grow through the oppositional force of gravity, right? Yeah. So they're kind of being pulled up by the sunlight, right? That's growing toward the sunlight and the photosynthesis. That process is, there's oppositional forces there, but it's growing up toward the sunlight and being pulled down to the earth at the same time, right?
Yes.
And so you have this kind of oppositional forces at work in nature, and we see a lot of those. But the synthetic result of those oppositional forces is productive of something new that is the product of both. Right?
Yeah. So this is emergence, basically, right?
Essentially, yeah. And so spiral dynamics are kind of built off of that kind of concept as well. So there's,
which is what makes me think, like, I don't know if I have this right, Jed, but you can help me with it. But this is that Trinitarian reality, right, where you have these two opposites, and because of the interplay between them, something new emerges, and so that you have this Trinitarian. What would you call that? Like an experience of the world, or yeah.
And there's and like, so Jordan's book, like his book on the whole mystery of Christ, is very much follows that kind of dialectical sort of process. You see that in Maximus's thinking as well. So like in Christ's person is the coincidence of opposites, right? The finite and the infinite natures.
Yeah, exactly.
Co-inhere in his person. And so there's, there's a good case to be made. Like there's people who will, find dialectical thinking, somewhat suspect, but I just think you can't escape it. And I think that, like MacDonald, what he brings that I find to be interesting, that pushes it beyond the realm of philosophy, right, is he's kind of engaged in the primary work of imagination here. Yeah. Which is actually the driver. So the philosopher, in a sense, it comes in behind imaginative people like MacDonald, right? Yeah. Because MacDonald is actually pushing that, using the imagination to actually drive that process forward. Right. Whereas the philosopher is just observing the process.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
And so, like, the imagination is it's the constructive tool of history. It is actually what shapes history.
Yeah, that's what
because nothing we do at any level ever doesn't involve the imagination at some level.
Yeah, no. Yeah.
Like the jeans I'm wearing had to be imagined at some point by a designer, and had to be, it had to be, put in through the loom in a certain way. The fabric had to come out a certain way, then it had to be stitched together in a certain way. And that work begins in the
well,
mind.
he calls the imagination the architect, right? And the intellect is the workman.
Yeah.
who works under the architect of imagination. I like that.
And the imagination doesn't necessarily see those oppositional forces at work as much as they work with them as one thing.
Yeah. It's always sees the whole.
It sees the whole, and then it's the intellect that then is able to differentiate.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And that's where, I think that's the difference between like wisdom and understanding. Right. Understanding is a rational process, but wisdom is a holistic, understanding is about making distinctions.
Yeah.
Right. And wisdom doesn't see distinctions.
Yeah.
Wisdom sees the whole.
It sees how those distinctions,
it sees
the interplay.
Unity.
It sees the interplay between the particular. Yeah.
Yeah, because I would say that it wouldn't necessarily deny the distinction, but it would certainly see well beyond it.
It's a different kind of lensing. It's a different kind of vision, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's like when you're at the doctor's office, getting your eyes checked, and they put all those different lenses in front of you. Well, you're perceiving things differently based on what kind of lens you're looking at things through.
It's almost like a holographic vision.
Mm-hmm.
Which I've heard Michael Martin say a bunch.
Okay.
I don't know what is that? What is holographic vision?
Like you can see beyond, like there's, oh man, well, I don't even know how I describe it, to be honest with you.
Could I describe like a very real sense without even knowing that that's what Michael's talked about? So when I do the meditations through the 7 heavens, and I work on that, and hopefully we'll put out more material on it at some point. But when I'm in the 7th heaven, or the 1st heaven, which is the heaven of wisdom. So, and it's the highest heaven. The 7th heaven is the lowest heaven, right? Highest heaven is the heaven of wisdom. When you're in that highest realm of wisdom, like one of the things that I see is I get this very striking like mental image of the tree of life. But what it looks like is it doesn't look like a normal tree. It looks like a crystal tree. It's like it's kind of like holographic. And then underneath it are the stones with our secret name written on them. But all of them are laid out under the tree, kind of like if you've ever seen how they grow champagne grapes and like cognac grapes and stuff like that in France, is they have all those white like limestone rocks along the vines themselves. Is kind of like that. So it's all spread out, and it's a really interesting place because it's like there's a stunning correspondence between light and sound. So there's like a music that accompanies that visual. It's like a vibrating, but everything seems to be kind of a one piece at the same time. So like but the visual, if you've ever seen like the hologram type stuff, there's a kind of a sheen to it and a clarity at the same time. So it's almost like clear like glass is the best way I could put it. So it's really interesting. Like when I see that, so when he's talking about like wisdom being holographic, like it's to see like a hologram kind of is what allows a multi-dimensional thing to be perceived as a whole.
Right.
So,
okay. I see.
Projection. It's a projection, and it's kind of the projector of what you actually ultimately end up seeing.
Sherry, if I could describe it in one of the ways that you've mentioned before, is seeing the different interpretations of, for instance, a story like Genesis as literal, moral, and allegorical or spiritual, and it's being able to see all those things at the exact same time.
Yeah,
which is, it's hard. Or I find it hard. I don't find it natural all the time, even though sometimes I'll slip into states of consciousness where it's easier.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
Yeah, it's the kind for me. It's only hard if I think about it.
That's probably it.
that's exactly, well, it's because it's above the rationale,
Right.
not irrational.
Yeah.
It's supra. It's above the ration. It's above the reason, and it's not
Right.
unreasonable. But you can't.
This gets
You
to
don't get there by
Desmond's.
thinking about it. You have. It's like you have to be. It's like anything. Like you can think about a Bob Dylan concert. You can think about his music all you want. You can read his lyrics. You're not gonna know what Bob Dylan's all about until you go to a concert or you put on an album and you experience it.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so it's a more of experiential.
Yeah. What you're saying there reminds me of a quote that, well, I just transcribed it from a video that he did, but from Matthias Desmond. He says, as soon as you participate in the eternal vibration of life around you, you feel that the end of your physical existence is not the end of your existence as a real being. And so I believe that we have to go through the process of rationality. What happened the last few hundred years is not meaningless, not without purpose. We have to climb the stairs of rationality step by step. But if we do it in a sincere way, we will soon reach a point where we know for sure that there is a land before us that we cannot enter through rationality. Yeah, and then he quotes René Thom, a famous mathematician, who said, this part of reality that can be understood in a rational way is very limited, and the rest of reality we can only know through empathically resonating with it.
Well, and this is okay. I love that quote because this is what the limitation of rationality is.
Yeah.
Reason itself is predicated on its opposite, which is doubt.
Right.
The process of doubt is fundamental to reason and discrimination, like discerning between this and that and making a distinction and in a sense suspending judgment. There's there's a certain skepticism to the reasoning process that is natural to reason itself.
Yeah, because you have to ask if what you're looking at is what you're actually seeing.
Yeah,
or what you're seeing is what you're looking at. Either way, right?
Yeah, and so there's a duality in the reasoning process, and I think like this gets into some of like Barfield's ideas on the evolution of consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
Final participation, I believe, is like a Sophianic kind of a vision, right? And it doesn't discard reason; it just eclipses it. Right? It's a different it's a different mode of knowing that that we can't that you can't ascend into until you've acquired reason and seen its limitations, right? So but this is not like an unknown thing. Like the scriptures, trust in the Lord with all your heart, lean not on your own understanding, right? The understanding is a valuable tool, but you don't lean on it. And so, like one of the things that I think is so valuable about MacDonald's works throughout his work is like he has this powerful moral intuition that he doesn't allow to obscure his reasoning.
Mm-hmm.
And, he emerges out of that, his Scottish Calvinism, because his moral intuitions that were at a higher level than the reasoning itself informed his reasoning.
Well, it's interesting because after having read the Hidden Life poem several times, I have to add, because I just couldn't get enough of it. He has an encounter with a woman in that poem, and it's just a chance encounter. But he's struck by her beauty in it. And she kind of literally rides off into the sunset and he never sees her again. Right. But that encounter with beauty changes everything for him. Suddenly the sun is brighter, the flowers are more beautiful. He feels like he can converse with the farm animals. He's energized, like, and this goes on for years because of this glimpse of beauty, right?
Yeah.
It's completely altered, you know, because the poem starts out, he's a younger man, he's like a boy almost. Well, he's a boy, and he's, you know, not too happy about doing all the farm chores, right? And wishes that he didn't have to. But after this encounter with beauty, he just meets everything as sacred, really.
Mm-hmm.
And
can I share something with that
yeah.
too?
Mm-hmm.
What's so funny is, like, so his encounter with this chance encounter with this beautiful woman. So in a poem I wrote, one night I was looking back on my youth, and so the poem is Sketches for a Wasted Youth, and trying to see, and what I was seeing in those episodes, I used like several different episodes from my life that were formative in some way.
Mm-hmm.
Just kind of played with them poetically, and what I was seeing in, like, even the broken and seemingly incongruous moments was like a real grace. So I was out at a club one night and was dancing with this beautiful woman, and it was, you know, 23 or something like that. We just had a great time. We connected, and it was amazing. It was like one of those magical moments. And but I entered her phone number. You know, we had those old Nokia phones, right, from back in the early 2000s, and I entered her phone number wrong in my phone, and so I never saw her again. You know, she was in the wind. She probably thought I was some jerk that didn't call her back, kind of thing.
Right.
So I ended up writing. I wrote about that experience, but about kind of where how grace kind of touched that experience. So connected. At some point, I can read it here. It's a short section, but it connects, like, the dance that we shared with a still higher dance that that was kind of the seeds of that yearning.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Even though you think, like, kids, you know, out drinking and dancing and all the kind of stuff you do in your early 20s, you know, but there was, like, you know, in retrospect, through that imaginative act of memory, I saw something in that moment that only memory could inform, you know.
Right.
So,
Well, do you want to read that section?
I can.
Yeah,
Here
I would
we
like
go.
to hear.
So this is one of the sections. So this is just called, this is the nightclub section. There is a big technical word I use there. There's a word called tourbillon, and it's a like a watch casing that helps the time accuracy. So anyway, for the young, Friday night's rhythm is a raucous thing when age has not turned time into a funeral rose. The mirror ball mimics heaven in a cacophony of sound, a song shining in the interstellar darkness, hovering over a haze of sweat and gin. The beat keeps the time that refuses to be kept, tourbillon encased against the grave's gravity, but demands to be spent like it's all we have. In a crowded club on a Friday night, there was only her and I, and the kind eyes that lifted my feet on the floor. Time is ignorance, a sensual dance to a sensual song on a spinning floor in a spinning room. Beneath the dance, there is nothing but unknowing. Hidden in the motion is an abyss of stillness, cradling the frail music with tender silence. I needed a stranger's arms gathering me in to drink her embrace for a moment of respite from the desiccated desire of the desert I carried with me wherever I went. I wasn't ready for the silence of God, so he came to me by her in the only way I could sense. Her soft lips were a prayer upon mine for a transcendence I could touch. There was the dancing desire pulsating with passion to find my way beyond sense by sense. In the dance between us, there was a certain sanctity. It's the sort of sanctity, it's the sort of holy the young feel when time is not a broken bottle pouring the last drops of youth upon the floor. It's hard to say what I was searching for in that gin-soaked haze, but what can be said is that it that through a broken glass there glittered something sacred, and she was an angel of mercy. I searched for that moment through countless nights, but never found it or her again. All we had, I thought, was time, when all we had was the dance. All we had, I thought, was each other, when all we had was our ignorance. All of the song that yet abides is the silence, all of the dance, the stillness. Now, there is a still more riotous dance, a Bacchic revelry, a light of all within the enlightening, the dance of all within the dancing, the song of all within the singing. Time is no longer ignorance. This procession has been transfigured by the erotic language of dance, closing the distance of sense and senseless by time beyond time. Revelation and hiddenness within the manifestation of the vacant transcendence of the prismic immanence, the spinning song of the mirrored ball on the spinning floor where the light is all in all. This is no fleshless dance. The mystery disclosed is in the body concealed, and the dancer and the dancing are one. Friday night's radiance glitters through a broken glass. Her kiss, a prayer for ecstatic intoxication. Her breath respired to heaven to become breathless. This, the death that concedes at last to the deathless, where the funeral rose and the victory rose are one, blooming in the desert garden. The song enfolding the silence, enfolding the singing, is the dance enfolding the stillness, enfolding the dancing, from which all motion and repose proceeds and returns in a syncopated rhythm that is the radiance of all in all.
Fabulous.
So sometimes there's a value in meeting a girl at a nightclub.
Yeah.
I'm not saying go out and do it, but you know.
Well, this is precisely why Rilke says the point is to live everything, right? Because if you don't courageously live in the world, then you don't have those experiences and you don't have those revelations.
I'm curious if this night obviously left you with an impression, and you, in writing this poem, was that impression revealed to you, or did you already?
No, it was in the act of writing. I didn't see it until I wrote it.
Yeah.
I mean, I knew what I wanted to. I knew that was an important event because it just was one that had stuck in my memory so clearly, right? But it didn't. Its meaning didn't occur to me until. That's like, I think, the third or fourth major movement within the poem. It's like a long work. I don't know. It's like 4,500 words. It's a long one. It's I don't know, 10, 12 pages, something like that. But anyway, so it was, these themes of the desert and the wilderness and the victory rose and the funeral rose, and like all these images are stacking throughout the poem. And then this was where, like, kind of the power of, like, the spiritual power of the erotic, when you remove the sexuality out of it, right? Where it's not about sex anymore. It's about at the level of your being, an interpenetration that's like an embrace that's very much modeled in our sexuality, right?
Well, it's where heaven meets earth.
Yeah. And there's a dance in that. And you realize that, like, that it's not, it's like, and so that's what I was seeing in that experience, was like all that longing that I felt as a 23-year-old kid, was actually signifying a much deeper longing that I couldn't see until I looked at it again.
Yeah. You needed some distance from it. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah.
I want to keep going here because we've only read one paragraph. So there is a wonderful passage about time in Shakespeare's Rape of Lucretia, which shows how he understood history. The passage is really about history and not about time, For time itself does nothing, not even blot old books and alter their contents. It is the forces at work in time that produce all the changes, and they are history. We quote for the sake of one line chiefly, but the whole stanza is pertinent. Time's, and this is the quote from Shakespeare, time's glory is to calm contending kings, to unmask falsehood and bring truth to light, to stamp the seal of time in aged things, to wake the morn and sentinel the night, to wrong the wronger till he render right, to ruinate proud buildings with thy hours, and smear with dust their glittering golden towers. To wrong the wronger till he render right. Here is a historical cycle worthy of the imagination of Shakespeare, yea, worthy of the creative imagination of our God, the God who made the Shakespeare with the imagination, as well as evolved the history from the laws which that imagination followed and found out.
Mm-hmm.
In full instance, we would refer our readers to Shakespeare's historical plays, and as a side illustration to the fact that he repeatedly represents his greatest characters when at the point of death, as relieving their overcharged minds by prophecy. Such prophecy is the result of the light of imagination, cleared of all distorting dimness by the vanishing of earthly hopes and desires cast upon the facts of experience. Such prophecy is the perfect working of the historical imagination.
Okay, Luke, I got a question for you. We talked about this when you and Jason and I talked, about
Yeah,
I was hoping you
the
would.
distinction between imagination and inspiration at the top level. When the imagination is truly inspired, there's no difference. It's imagination still.
Yeah.
And I think so when I look back at the writings of the prophets, I see and this is it comes out of also Walter Brueggemann's work on the prophetic imagination. It is a work of imagination.
Mm-hmm.
And with the imagination, they created the future.
Yeah.
Okay, so let me just intercede here quickly, because this brings to mind Matthew Pajot's point about Joseph's dream. So in the telling of his dream to his brothers, he makes the dream come true. He has a dream, and he could have not told it, but it was so perplexing that he told his brothers, and in telling them, the dream started to unravel into real life. Think about that. I think that's what you just said previously reminded me of that, Jed,
Yeah. Well, and that dream was a failure for decades until it came true.
Yeah.
Everything that, I liked how you put that as the unraveling of the dream, which kind of is almost like the unraveling of his coat of many colors. There's this unraveling that happens in Joseph's life as a result of that dream. I mean, the last people you tell your dreams to are your brothers. He should have known that. Sisters, moms, His mom wasn't around though.
That's a good point. Yeah.
But so the unraveling of the dream was foundational to its accomplishment.
Mm-hmm. I know it's really really interesting.
But it was actualized when he spoke it.
I think I mentioned this to you. I don't know if I mentioned this to you or not, Jed, but I had this experience where when my youngest daughter was really little, she asked, we were living in Switzerland, and she said, "Mommy, what's your dream?" And she meant what's the thing you dream of that you really want? Can you draw me your dream? And so I drew this log cabin and a little creek and a wood pile and some trees and, and it wasn't until decades later that I was up at the goat barn and I turned around, and my husband had just cut down a bunch of cottonwood trees and stacked them up in between two trees up there. Mm-hmm. And I turned around and there was my dream. Like exactly what I drew on that day. Right. Mm-hmm. And I, now just thinking about Joseph, I was living in it
already.
Like, and I wonder how long it took Joseph to realize like that this was his dream. Like, I bet you it all clicked when all the brothers showed up hungry.
Mm-hmm.
And then he was like, oh my God, I'm in my dream, Mm-hmm. So interesting.
Earlier on in the essay, George talked about how the imagination supersedes the act of poetry, which is kind of obvious. But I have the quote, I think it's Percy Shelley, poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world, in the back of my mind as you guys are talking. And to me, that's even true in regards to like our understanding of a concept like gravity. It was imagined and then here it is, and all the mathematical laws fall in place for us with a kind of precision that is just sort of unbelievably accurate. It's like I don't know exactly what I'm trying to say, but I think what the trouble I have with this, which is will always probably be my issue, is because I don't know if I have ever had any sort of delineation in my mind, even though I felt the need for one, between what is prophetic or revelatory and my own imagination. Because it seems like there should be some sort of difference there. And I guess what I'm trying to say is I've written my whole life and been creating stories and have I been prophesying that whole time, and I don't know what I'm trying to say, but I also am trying to figure out at what point is it me, and I keep getting back to this, like a me projecting versus me receiving something. And
yes,
yeah, exactly. And I'm always trying to locate as if there's some sort of difference between those things. And I think that's where the creating any sort of hard and fast rule there is just.
I want to say this, Luke, to you. I actually think, because I know that this from my own experience, and I could be wrong, and you can correct me if you think I'm wrong. But when I first started listening to Jonathan Pageau, for example, I was having so much trouble understanding what he was talking about, until one day I thought, I'm trying too hard. It's like the thing I talked about before, where if I think about it, I can't conceive of it, right?
Sure.
And so what I realized is that I actually think like that. Like, I don't think in distinctions, right? And I see these things being thrown together, right? Symbolos. That's what it means, to be thrown together. And as soon as I stopped trying to extract them from each other, I started to understand Jonathan Pageau better, because I realized that that's actually how I see the world, but because I had never experienced not seeing the world that way, I didn't know the difference. I thought, that I had to make distinctions, and like everybody else was, and they were talking with big words, and they were talking about this category and that ism and this over here, and I was like, I'm lost. Like, I was so lost, and I couldn't make sense of anything.
Yeah.
And this is we talked about poetic relations in the essay. I think I've been thinking a lot about that. This poetic relations are when you see the things thrown together. I had a conversation with Nate and his ex-wife on poetry a long while back, and she was trying to express what's happening when you write a poem. And she said, well, and all she could do was talk about the relation, the poetic relation. And she expressed it in such a way that she said, you see a drop of dew on a blade of grass. And then she just fell short of words, right? Because that's what you do. It gets back to that Blake quote where you see the world in a grain of sand, right? And if that's how you're moving through the world and through life, and I think most poets do that just by nature, then tearing it all apart becomes very confusing to that.
It's super disorienting.
It's totally disorienting. And you're surrounded by people who do that. Most people do that.
Well, I would say even people that I admire greatly, like
and I don't think there's anything wrong with it. I'm just saying that if you are not that person, if you live in a world of poetic relations, right, where your blueberry was your dog, okay, that because Luke wrote a poem about that, which I just love. Then extracting them apart, the dog and the blueberry, it's never going to make sense to you, Luke. Never.
I think what I'm taught, and maybe this is going to be another distinction, but I heard Ian McGilchrist. This is a guy that I'm valuing, or is salient to me right now.
And me too.
But it's he talks about the difference between apprehending something and comprehending something, and I couldn't tell you the difference between those things, but one seems to be a projection versus something that is overcomes you, and I think that's what I was always looking in my understanding. Specifically, I'm thinking back to experiences in Pentecostal circles where I felt like I was projecting in those places versus being overcome with something, as if I was gonna, in order for what I was speaking to be prophetic, my own self needed to be removed from that situation, as if I was an empty vessel for the Holy Ghost to operate through me. You know what I'm saying? Now I feel like that's such a wrong-headed sort of understanding, where I am an integral part of this process.
You're the temple where it's taking place.
And my imagination is the function through which this is even possible to begin with. So my starting position was where I feel like I'm projecting it is actually the reality.
Well, it's like there's two things happening in inspiration and imagination. It's the upward movement of the imagination that's being pulled up. There's something pulling it up.
Yes.
And then you got the descent of inspiration, like heaven coming down, and there's this pull and this push that comes together, and the sparks of inspiration and imagination, when they meet, it's palpable. And it's not I know that MacDonald draws the distinction between fancy and imagination, right? To image something forth, really to have a crystal image of what it is that you want to bring into the world of finite things, essentially.
You know, I think the poem that you read, or the portion of your poem that you read, Judd, is a perfect example of the difference between fancy and imagination, because what George MacDonald says is that the duty of the imagination is to find out the workings of God.
Yeah.
Okay. And that's what happened to that night that you described, right? Where you moved from the actual event into the workings of God. Right? And that is the duty of the imagination. And I mean, that's really helped me to make that distinction, because I'm not good at distinctions. Right? But I'm like, okay, so if I'm doing that thing, right, which I have to say most of the time that is what my imagination is doing. It's work, it's trying to find out the workings of God, right? Then I'm not in the realm of fancy, and that's the only way I can understand that, right? Is that, yeah. So anyway, I just wanted to say that I think that that's a really good example, what you read.
Yeah. So one of my favorite authors is he writes in a lot of different genres, but he was a great science fiction author, Dan Simmons. I don't know if you're familiar with his books, but his Hyperion Cantos is, in a sense, is an extended meditation on the works of John Keats, among others. So he has there's a character in one of his books, is a poet. His name is Martin Silenus, right? And he's this rascally, like just everything you think about, like a poet, like almost like a Byron-esque type personality, He's just larger than life. But he has this line where he says to be a poet is to become God, which is, I found to be an interesting statement. And so the premise of this book is, in a sense, Silenus believes that he's writing the apocalyptic future in his poetry. And as it turns out, he is, right? So it's a very interesting kind of work in the imagination. But then he has another series of novels that go back and explore the literature of Proust, the poetry of Shakespeare, and the Trojan War. So it turns out that this whole story is taking place in a universe that is the product of the mind of Proust, Shakespeare, and Homer.
Wow.
And that the work of genius is what births new universes. And I always thought I was struck by those ideas when I was younger, reading through them. And then I, began to kind of delve into kind of the Christian mystics, but, also heavily into the metaphysics of, like the Neoplatonic metaphysics. And one of the things that it talks about was thinking being, right? That being is transparent to thought, perceptive to the mind. The mind can see being, and that, and I started kind of drawing the connections, maybe out of this secret desire for this fictional story to have some air of truth in it. And I began to see that, like, creation is this infinite unfolding process where every possibility in God is actualized in the world of finite things, right? And so there's this infinite unfolding. And so the reason why I say that, Luke, is I think that when you are writing a story, when anyone is writing a story, they are at minimum sketching the outline of a world that can be, and that I believe one day will be. I know that's kind of out there, but so like, yeah, I think that that's a real thing. And like my meditation process takes me into like some imaginative spaces. I engage the imagination when I meditate. And so one of like the images that came to me not too terribly long ago was really like thrilling, because it was like a discovery, is like the tree of life is very prominent in my meditations, right? It shows up in everywhere I meditate. And it's kind of like this anchoring metaphor. So in the seventh heaven, which is the heaven of wonder, where we discover that God is God and we're God's creatures, right? So we see the difference between ourselves and God. In the highest heavens, you don't see the difference. You are one with God. But here, it's founded off of the idea of like the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Well, fear is in a sense a kind of wonder. So that's where I see that wonder is the beginning of wisdom. And so I saw the tree of life, and it has like, it's a very beautiful, it looks like an oak tree, and it's got like this fountain of living water that feeds it, but the water is almost like this opalescent rainbow water. It runs through the tree, and so the tree is like shining with all this light. So when I was perceiving this tree in one of the meditations, I went up and I touched one of those veins of living water that was running through the tree, and I was pulled inside of the tree. And what I saw when I was inside of the tree of life was just this stack upon stack of this fractal unfolding of universe upon universe upon universe upon universe upon universe. And then I saw from within me, universe upon universe upon universe filling me. And then I could see people around me, and they were filled with the same things. And then it all contracted. And then it went inside of me. And I realized that I am in the tree of life, and the tree of life is in me. And what I'm perceiving is the body of Christ. And this infinite unfolding of every possibility in which Christ can be actualized, which is limitless. Right? And so like I do believe that the human imagination is actually constructive of worlds that God will give life to. Like, so that's where like our fiction writing, I think, is actually at least scaffolding into something much larger at the eschatological horizon when we.
Well, I mean, if we take the structure that George MacDonald lays out for this essay in the beginning, where he says that, all words are poetic, and all of those words are, like the actual, how did he put that, Luke, about language? Half of our language is from the imagination, right? And that the imagination is that in which we live and move and have our being. And that nature is the forms, and our imagination is the light that lights the lamp in the forms. Right? And the meaning is already existent within the forms. Okay, so if you take all that, and with what Jed just said, and you talk about anything, or you write a story or a poem about anything, you're talking about something that already is. Okay. It's already given, because all your imagination is doing is lighting the lamp within the forms, and the meaning is already there, right? So, like, he actually makes the claim that our creative faculty is not very creative, because God has actually just given us everything from which we can create, right?
Well, there's a lovely like Trinitarian structure to this too, right?
Yes.
If you think about what the imagination is composed, what the imagination produces, and what it's composed, like how it comes together. So you have three simultaneous things happening, right? You have the imagination, you have the image that it produces, and you have the inspiration, right? Those are simultaneous, right? And in a sense, like the Father's imagination is productive of the Son and inspired by the Spirit, right? Is like there's a sense of the imaging forth in God that is the model for all of our creativity. It's just we're imaged forth and imaging forth God in creation. That's what we do. That's the imagination is, in a sense, it's our ladder into the Father's heart. It's where we become like God.
Shall we read some more?
Yes.
All right. In the interpretation of individual life, the same principles hold, and nowhere can the imagination be more healthily and rewardingly occupied than in endeavoring to construct the life of an individual out of the fragments which are all that can reach us of the history of even the noblest of our race. How this will apply to the reading of the gospel story we leave to the earnest thought of our readers. We now pass to one more sphere in which the student imagination works in glad freedom, the sphere which is understood to belong more immediately to the poet. We have already said that the forms of nature, and here he's going to go into what I just said, I think. We have already said that the forms of nature, by which word forms we mean any of those conditions of nature which affect the senses of man, are so many approximate representations of the mental conditions of humanity. The outward, commonly called the material, is informed by, or has form in virtue of, the inward or immaterial. In a word, the thought. The forms of nature are the representations of human thought in virtue of their being the embodiment of God's thought, which is just what Jed was talking about.
Mm-hmm.
As such, therefore, they can be read and used to any depth, shallow or profound. Men of all ages and all developments have discovered in them the means of expression, and the men of ages to come, before us in every path along which we are now striving, must likewise find such means in those forms, unfolding with their unfolding necessities. The man, then, who, in harmony with nature, attempts the discovery of more of her meanings, is just searching out the things of God. The deepest of these are far too simple for us to understand as yet. That's a good sentence. But let our imagination interpretive reveal to us one severed significance of one of her parts, and such is the harmony of the whole, that all the realm of nature is open to us henceforth, not without labor and in time. Upon the man who can understand the human meaning of the snowdrop, of the primrose, or of the daisy, and these feature in Fantasties, these flowers, as fairies. The life of the earth blossoming into the cosmical flower of a perfect moment will one day seize, possessing him with its prophetic hope, arousing his conscience with the vision of that rest that remaineth, and stirring up the aspiration to enter into that rest. Thine is the tranquil hour, purpureal eve, but long as godlike wish or hope divine informs my spirit, ne'er can I believe that this magnificence is wholly thine. From worlds not quickened by the sun, a portion of the gift is won, an intermingling of heaven's pomp is spread on ground which British shepherds tread.
British.
Should I read on? Or do you want to talk about any of that? I think we actually talked about it before we got to it.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's because we're imagining with George.
That's right. We're tracking. Even the careless curve of a frozen cloud across the blue will calm some troubled thoughts, may slay some selfish thoughts. And what shall be said of such gorgeous shows as the scarlet poppies and the green corn, the likest we have to those lilies of the field which spoke to the Savior himself of the care of God, and rejoiced his eyes with the glory of their God-devised array. From such visions as these, the imagination reaps the best fruits of the earth, for the sake of which all the science involved in its construction is the inferior, yet willing and beautiful support. From what we have now advanced, will it not then appear that on the whole the name given by our Norman ancestors is more fitting for the man who moves in these regions than the name given by the Greeks? Is not the poet, the maker, a less suitable name for him? And I don't know what this...
Trouva.
Trouve,
the finder.
Trouve, which is French for to find, right? The finder. At least, must not the faculty that finds precedes the faculty that utters? The faculty that finds precedes the faculty that utters. But there is nothing to be said of the function of the imagination from the Greek side of the question. Does it possess no creative faculty? Has it no originating power? Certainly it would be a poor description of the imagination which omitted the one element especially present to the mind that invented the word poet. It can present us with new thought, forms, new, that is, as revelations of thought. It has created none of the material that goes to make these forms, nor does it work upon raw material, but it takes forms already existing and gathers them about a thought so much higher than they, that it can group and subordinate and harmonize them into a whole which shall represent, unveil that thought. The nature of this process we will illustrate by examination of the well-known bugle song in Tennyson's Princess. So I'm going to stop there for now in case you guys want to talk about some of that.
Because he's just
going for it.
So
yeah, Kazi, you can totally join us. I put a link here.
Yeah, if you want to jump in, Kazi, would love to.
Yeah,
love to have you join us with George.
Little old George.
Did anything stick out in that last little bit? I feel like there's so much going over my head.
What's going over your head? Let's deal with those things. Exactly. Like, let's get specific. Let's get particular.
I'm trying to find where he said it. Well, even that sentence, the deepest of these is far too simple for us to understand yet.
Mm-hmm.
I love that. It just goes to show, like we've said earlier, the nature that we have to complicate. Like the whole is a harmony, and it is going to be one, which is a much more simpler number.
I think George MacDonald in one of his unspoken sermons actually says something like, he's critiquing like high-minded theologians who he's in disagreement with, and he said he accuses them of not looking low enough, and this gets back to this simple that he's talking about, right?
Well, and like Blake's eternity in an hour, and like
the poetic relation that is really what he's talking about in that sense, right? Because we're the kind of creature that fails to see the thing that we see the most of.
Mm-hmm.
Right? We only notice the thing we don't see very often. Did you see that bird? Did you see that flower, that purple flower? But the thing we see all the time, and this struck me once when I realized, I looked into the behavior of ravens, because I always have a pair of ravens that live here. And they have so many different vocalizations, and I mimic them. And then, they always, and I don't know if I'm saying bad things to them or good things, because I mimic them. Mm-hmm. And so I was looking up some of their vocalizations, and there's like so little known about ravens. And it's because they're common. And that's how we are. Like, to me, that just teaches me how silly we are. Mm-hmm. to glance over the thing that is common to us, right? And what is common to us is creation. And now, even worse, we travel at 100 kilometers an hour. I don't know how fast you go in the States, but down the highway, and it's just whizzing by.
88 miles an hour trying to get to 1985 all the time.
So like, yeah, anyway, that's Just
You know what's funny about like what you say about ravens? We used to have where I lived in Southern California was like a flight path for just it seemed like all the ravens that lived in the valley. So sometimes there was like upwards of thousands flying if they, like, I don't know, had a family.
Were they ravens or crows? Because crows
Ravens.
do that. Oh, really?
Ravens. They're actually, like, California ravens are a little bit a little bit of a larger raven species. But what was funny is, like, but usually I'd have a family of them in and around the trees in my neighborhood. And I just, I usually would sit out in front of my window when I would try to write, and sometimes I just would stare out at the window and watch the birds. And what was really funny is, because like ravens mate in pairs. So you have a parental pair, and then, then they raise their families in various ages, right? And the juveniles, the teenage ravens, are just assholes.
Oh, yeah.
All they do all day long is they just bug their parents, bug until the parent raven snaps and goes after them, puts them in their place. And I'm like, I know that. I'm connected with you guys. I get what's going on here. It was so funny because they just would pester and pester and pester and pester.
You know what's happening right now in Ravenland is, so they're building their nest now because they could actually have laid eggs. They start very early.
Mm-hmm.
But in mid-February, they would find their favorite trees. They've got a couple of dead trees up by the barn that they like to hang out on because they can watch and see where I'm spreading grain, and
Mm-hmm.
and there's the most intimate, the most gentle grooming going on with the two of them, where one grooms the other and the other one's just, and they snuggle right close to each other, and it's so cute because it's breeding season, right? And so, yeah, I don't know why I started talking about that, but it just, yeah, it's so disappointing to me that people don't understand the raven, that they don't know the raven, and yet the raven is fully adapted to living just about anywhere.
Yeah.
First Nations myth is full of raven. Okay. They're incredibly smart. Like, they're just like, they're our rival. I would even go so far as to say, like, they can really, I've had them kill chickens, and they're so, they're so smart that they can be very frustrating.
Well, and they every once in a while will keep a prophet alive, fueling that prophetic imagination.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They're an interesting, even if you connect that even to like the bigger, we're talking about the small, the raven, and what we learn from the raven. But what we learn from the raven connects to everything.
Yeah.
Yes.
Right. It connects to, I can see the connection to my family and my family life and the family life of this family of ravens.
Yeah.
Right? And Mr. Raven, of course, he's wonderful. But then you connect that to like the human family, and then the divine family, and you see this continuity all the way through.
Yeah.
And I think that's what, like, when you're talking about MacDonald kind of taking, the high-minded theologians of his time to task, is like, they aren't, they don't have the ability sometimes if you're just focused on the rational process, what you miss is the interconnection between all things.
That's right. Yeah.
Right? Yeah. And you have to be able, sometimes you have to start with the particular so that you can see the whole.
Well, that's what Luke quotes a lot. What is that? The particular is the playground of the imagination.
Yeah. And I don't know who said it, but yeah. And that's where the multiplicity is, or at least the multiplicity that I've come to know.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So it's like, I don't know.
I was thinking about beauty the other day, because there's something about beauty that, in which you really need the particular, right? Like, in order to see it. Like, I think, I don't know if I'll be able to say this properly, but I think that what beauty does is it shows you how the particular works together or is connected, you know? So let's take a face, for example. You know, a beautiful face is a face that all the parts come together in such a way that it strikes you as
Mhm.
beautiful. You know, you don't see the whole, you actually see the parts, right? I think it was McGilchrist that said that perfectly symmetrical people don't like perfectly symmetrical faces. They creep them out
Mhm.
because they don't look real,
Mhm.
which is another interesting thing. Like, you know, that flaw is kind of like necessary for beauty to be
Asymmetry.
present, asymmetry.
Mhm.
But then there's also the symmetry of let's say a diesel engine, right? Like you look at all the parts of a diesel engine, and then you get overwhelmed with the beauty of it when you turn that thing over and it all works together. Like there's something about how the particular gets caught up into the whole that
Mhm.
evokes a sense of beauty, I think. I don't know what you guys think of that.
I have a thought, but I don't know if it'll be related. But just the necessity of the particular's finitude, in that it is broken, in a sense, that it what I think I'm trying to get at is that the very fact that they fail, finite images fail their form, is what pulls us beyond, because we're seeking something more than what is potentially available in the finite image.
Mhm.
If that makes sense.
They fail their forms. I'm trying to figure out, like, what do you
Like,
mean exactly?
so like any sort of incarnation is a sacrifice, whether it's a word or an image or whatever is represented in a material, concrete reality
Mhm.
that is, spatial, temporal, whatever.
Mhm.
It's it sacrifices itself to become what it is,
Mhm.
if that makes sense. And so then,
Yeah, Eliot writes about that in his four quartets, like when
Mhm.
he's talking about his failures as a poet, like, and he calls every word a failure.
Mhm.
Mhm.
Right?
It's
He
almost
calls it like a raid on the inarticulate.
So are you hinting at like the
but
ineffable? The ineffable? Is that what?
I'm hinting at the beauty in brokenness, or that's
Oh,
what I was.
oh,
I wanted to tie that
Yeah.
back in, but I
okay.
didn't get that far, and I don't even know if I was capable of bringing it back to that
But I
point.
think that that's I think that that's like that's kind of in the like the wabi sabi aesthetic in Zen,
Mhm.
right? Is like that there's a beauty in age and in brokenness and in the it's produced by the ravages of time, right? Or like it connected to that is like the kintsugi art, right? Of putting back together the broken pottery with the golden enamel. And all of a sudden, like the pottery is stronger than it was before it was broken, and it's of more worth since it was broken.
Mhm.
And like there's a kind of there's a necessity of failure. Like it has to fail to live to its formal perfection in order to attain its perfection. Like the
Mhm.
sacrifice that you're talking about is like fundamental. And
Well, you know, I was talking about this in the Voxer today, Jed. I said something like, in order for anything to be reconciled, which is what that pottery is that you're talking about, right?
mhm,
Because reconciliation then makes it stronger than it was before.
mhm,
It necessarily does, right?
mhm,
But in order for anything to be reconciled, it has to be divided. first, right? And this is what I saw that day years and years ago was the necessity for the brokenness, right? For because of like the pottery that you're talking about, it had be in the process of it being put back together again, it actually becomes permanent, right?
Yeah.
This-
So
Like
before it was
like this.
fragile and held the capacity or held the potential to be broken forever, right? That's why everything had to be driven out before, right? And the tree of like, what was the other tree that was guarded?
Tree of knowledge.
No, life, right?
Tree of life. Okay.
So, like, you couldn't allow for the brokenness to remain forever. You had to give it the opportunity to be reconciled into this permanent state, right? And that's what I saw that day. And so whenever anybody talks about these things, I just have to say amen and amen, because that, yeah. And so it makes sense to me that we don't like perfection. Like, to look at it, it's not beautiful to us, right? What an example that comes to my mind is, I remember as a kid in the 70s, wallpaper was a thing, and my mother got this like a god awful wallpaper and put it in the bathroom, and it drove me up because you sit in the bathroom, okay, and all you have to look at is this wallpaper, and it started to just like nails on a chalkboard, right? Because it's this perfectly symmetrical, sterile pattern that just bombards you with nothingness. Like that's what the wallpaper was doing to me. And I'd rather have like an old plastered wall that's slightly cracked and maybe not even straight, There's something beautiful about that.
Like there's like the best we can hope for in this world, I think, like whether scientific, poetic, or anything else, is verisimilitude, right? It's like getting close to the truth.
Oh yeah.
Right. Yeah. It's a representation of the real, right? And
yet, okay, so what do you think of this though? Like, because we have to know what the real is in order to know it, right? That we're that close.
Yeah, and I think we all, I mean, like even in our like the songs we learn as a kid, row, row, row your boat gently down the stream, merrily, 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 life is but a dream. Like, we have a sense that there's a life that we will wake into, that there's a dreamlike quality to the existence we're in, right? So I think we have it. That's an innate sense, but the imagination is what drives you into that sense of what is real.
Yeah, see, this is where beauty gets interesting for me, because what beauty does is it says this is real.
Yeah,
that's what it says.
Well, Keats says that. Keats's criterion for truth is beauty.
Yes.
This is the only truth you need know, right?
Yeah.
And
it doesn't lie, actually.
And it's like and then it goes into the question of what we find beautiful, right? Okay. And versus just what has a great appearance versus what is truly beautiful, right? Because if you can't see beauty in patina or in aging, or you know what I mean, there's a beauty in all things.
Yeah.
And it's there, but like it takes
well, they are the most beautiful, because you can't predict them, right? You can't. anticipate the lines anymore, right? Like on an old face, on an old wrinkled face, you just have to search the face for them, right?
You know,
You don't,
yeah.
they're not like, oh, here's one and it's going to go here and then it's going to go, no, the face has to be, it has to be searched. And in that, and then what happens, I think, is that you enter into that poetic relation with that thing, and symbolos happens, right? And that's beauty, when the two things are thrown together. The what am I looking for here? Anyway, I'll just leave it at that because I don't know what.
Can I don't want to sound like a broken record, but I could read the that John Vervaeke quote that I really like about beauty.
Yes.
Beauty is when we have good phenomenological reason to believe that appearances are disclosing reality, that our attempts to make sense phenomenologically, not just conceptually, are in contact with reality.
I gotta read you a quote here that I have. I just thought of it because of what I was saying about searching the lines in a face, and you can't anticipate, right? You can't anticipate what's coming next. And that's the thing about the wallpaper that drove me nuts. Because I could constantly anticipate the next pattern, right? Because it was the same. So Friedrich Hundertwasser, Friedreich, actually, which means Kingdom of Peace, 100 Waters. Okay. So he's a little bit of a German hippie, but he was an architect, and he made these wonky buildings. Okay. No straight lines. That's his deal. So this is what he says about the straight line. And I just love this. In 1953, I realized that the straight line leads to the downfall of mankind. But the straight line has become an absolute tyranny. The straight line is something cowardly drawn with a rule, without thought or feeling. It is a line which does not exist in nature. And that line is the rotten foundation of our doomed civilization. Even if there are certain places where it is recognized that this line is rapidly leading to perdition, its course continues to be plotted. The straight line is godless and immoral. The straight line is the only uncreative line, the only line which does not suit man as the image of God. The straight line is the forbidden fruit. The straight line is the curse of our civilization. Any design undertaken with the straight line will be stillborn. Today we are witnessing the triumph of rationalist know-how, and yet at the same time, we find ourselves confronted with emptiness, an aesthetic void, desert of uniformity, criminal sterility, loss of creative power. Even creativity is prefabricated. We have become impotent. We are no longer able to create. That is our real illiteracy.
I have to say something. Like, you know what we call, like, when somebody's down to earth, you know, it's like they let their imperfections show. And then, like, you see other people and you're like, man, you're such a square, you know, and it's this geometric, you know, concoction of lines. But I was thinking about also the Ouroboros being a continuous line.
Yeah.
Well, he's right that it is the tree of knowledge, right? It's rationale.
Yes, it is.
Abstracted from everything else.
Yeah.
That produces the straight line logic that will lead us directly off of the cliff.
Yeah, straight down, straight over the edge.
Right. And it's like there's a
key word there.
It's like, you know, in that poem I wrote, like I riffed off of Eliot in what is The Wasteland. Like, this is how will the world end, with a bang or with a whimper, right?
Yeah.
And I decided to kind of riff off of that and said that the world's going to end with somebody's good idea. Right. And it's like, we have these like rational ideas that like they turn against us, like at the most fundamental level, right? So the power of the atom that we unlocked with our rational capabilities, could power cities or could level them.
Yeah, like I've talked about the straight line in the sense that so when you're learning to train horses, you can't move in straight lines around them ever, because the straight line is predatory. Only carnivores move in straight lines. Herbivores move like this, right? Mm-hmm. And so when you approach horses, you have to approach. You focus your body energy at the shoulder, and then you focus it at the hip, and then to the shoulder, and then to the hip, and they'll stand still. I can control the movement of my horses in a huge open field by where I put my body energy, and of course that moves my body, mm-hmm. right? And when that happens, I'm avoiding the straight line. So, a lot of people think they'll go out to catch a horse and they'll take a halter and hide it behind their back because they think the reason the horse is running away is because they can see the halter. No, the reason the horse is running away is because they're moving in a straight line towards it.
Yeah.
And only predators do that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. So immediately all of their instinct for fight or flight kick in, and of course they run first, right? If they can. Yeah. So, and that's why I loved that Hundebalser.
It's powerful.
Because I understand the straight line in the sense that it's also a predatory line, right? And I think that's why he can say it's godless and immoral.
Yeah.
Right. And that it leads to perdition. But I don't know if he knows that. But see, this is the beauty of the beauty of reality,
mm-hmm.
right? Because it's always gonna say the same thing, no matter what.
Mm-hmm.
No matter what.
I feel like you've just given me the permission to not walk the straight and narrow. Not that I ever have. Well, I tell you what, I gotta duck out just because I've got to get ready for work and got to make a couple of phone calls to friends and family before I close out the night. But I've loved this conversation. It was really awesome. So thank you for inviting me.
Good. Yeah, I'm glad you came.
It was a surprise. It was so good to see your face pop up.
I know. We gotta spend some more time on this. I love, this is like the area that I'm probably most passionate about.
Yeah. And what's really interesting, I just want to say this before you go, Jed, is that the three of us are poets.
Mm-hmm.
And whenever George MacDonald wants to really illustrate his point, he throws in a stanza from a poem, right? Like you can't talk about this
mm-hmm.
without poetry. It's impossible.
Yeah.
Impossible.
Yeah. Totally.
Yeah. It's beautiful.
Well, I definitely feel nice and filled up. So thank you. And
okay, well, have a good rest of your evening.
Later. Okay, take care.
Bye, Jed.
Bye.
I guess we could wrap it up here too, Luke, if you want.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely feel myself dwindling. So unless you have some more statements, there's so much that will flash through my mind while you guys are talking, and
well, the beauty of having this recorded is that we can. And I've been doing this is I've been re-listening to our conversations and actually learning something new every time I do it.
Because it's the same for me.
It's just been really wonderful. I wanted to kind of close out with a poem just for the sake of the beauty of poetry. And it's not my poem. It's written by a Belgian a Belgian poet. He's actually, like, I guess, one of the most famous Belgian poets out there. And I just happened to stumble across his poetry thanks to the internet. And I think that this poem illustrates a lot of what we've been talking about, poetic relations and all words are poetic. But it also really illustrates well how the imagination lights the lamp within the forms, right? And the forms already contain their meaning. So, and before I read the poem, I just wanted to say I had this insight, and I don't know what you think, but I always wondered why C.S. Lewis had a lamp in Narnia.
Did he have a lamp?
Yeah, when they get through the wardrobe, there's a lamppost in the woods.
Yeah.
And I'm like, I'm getting goosebumps again just thinking about it, because I'm like, is that the lamp that lights? Right? The imagination is the light that lights the lamp
inside the forms.
Inside the forms. I think that's a total, what do you call that? Shout out to George MacDonald.
Oh, I think so, for sure.
Right? And then I Googled a whole bunch of lamppost essays just out of curiosity, and none of them got it. None of them mentioned that. It's the center of Narnia, or it's,
Sure.
and there's actually a land. It's been so long since I read the Narnia Chronicles, but there's actually a land that is, what is it called? The Lampless Land or something?
Where's that?
In Narnia?
In Narnia?
Yeah.
So this is gonna map onto George MacDonald's shadow.
The wasted, what's it? Wasted. The lamp wastes or something like that.
Yeah, even as like the inaugural initiation or some sort of thing.
Okay. So it's called Lantern Waste. Is another land it was a heavily wooded northwestern territory of the Kingdom of Narnia. Lantern Waste was called. So anyway, I was really excited when that landed on my.
That's really cool.
On my head.
Wild.
Okay, I'm going to close out with this, and it's called Joy by Emile Verhaeren, and he's a Belgian poet. I have to put my glasses back on. O splendid, spacious day, irradiate with flaming dawns, when earth shows yet more fair her ardent beauty, proud, without alloy, and wakening life breathes out her perfume, rare so potently that all intoxicate. Our ravished being rushes upon joy. Be thanked, mine eyes, that now ye still shine clear beneath my furrowed brow, to see afar the light vibrating there. And you, my hands, that in the sun yet thrill, and you, my fingers, that glow golden still among the golden fruit upon the wall where hollyhocks stand tall. Be thanked, my body, that thyself dost bear, yet firm and swift and quivering to the touch of the quick breezes or of winds profound. And you, straight frame and lungs outbreathing wide along the shore or on the mountainside, the sharp and radiant air that bathes and grips the mighty worlds around. O festal mornings, calm in loveliness, rose whose pure face the dewdrops all caress, birds flying toward us like some presage white, gardens of somber shade or frailest light. What time the ample summer warms the glade, I love you, roads, by which came hither late, she who held hidden in her hands my fate. I love you, distant marshes, woods austere, and to its depths I love the earth, where here, beneath my feet, my dead to rest are laid. So I exist in all that doth surround and penetrate me, all this grassy ground, these hidden paths and many a copse of beach, clear water that no clouding shadow reach. You have become to me, myself, because you are my memory. In you my life prolonged forever seems. I shape, I am all that hath filled my dreams. In that horizon vast that dazzles me, trees shimmering with gold my pride are ye, and like the knots upon your trunk, my will strengthens my power to sane staunch labor still. Rose of the pearl-hued gardens, when you kiss my brow, a touch of living flame it is. To me all seems one thrill of ardor, beauty, wild caress, and I, in this world drunkenness, so multiply myself in all that gleams on dazzled eyes, that my fainting heart vents itself in cries. O leaps of fervor strong, profound, and sweet, as though some great wing swept thee off thy feet, if thou hast felt them upward hearing thee toward infinity. Complain not, man, even in the evil day. Whate'er disaster takes thee for her prey, thou to thyself shalt say that once, for one short instant all supreme, which time may not destroy, thou yet hast tasted, with quick beating heart, sweet, formidable joy. And that thy soul, beguiling thee to set as in a dream, hath fused thy very being's inmost part with the unanimous great founts of power, and that day supreme, that single hour, hath made a god of thee. And that's it. I thought it would be appropriate to close out with a poem, especially that one.
Mhm. That was really good.
All right. Well,
All right.
thanks a lot, Lukey.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm looking outside and there's like all of a sudden 3 inches of snow.
Oh, no.
I had no idea it was coming.
Work to do tomorrow.
Yeah.
All right. Good night, everybody. Thank you very much. And I'm going to end now.
All right. Good night.